She was on her knees before she knew what hit her. 1 second, Mara Bennett was moving through Denver International Airport, badge clipped to her lanyard, rolling a carry-on with a broken wheel. The next, 210 pounds of Belgian Malinois came barreling through the terminal at full sprint, leash snapping behind him like a cracked whip, and hit her like a freight train of fur and muscle and memory. The dog didn't knock her down. She went to her knees voluntarily. She knew exactly what he needed. Around her, travelers froze. A child screamed. 2 TSA officers were already running, but Mara's hands were already moving, one at the dog's jaw, one at his neck, and she was whispering something that nobody in that crowd could hear. Nobody except the officer who'd been chasing that dog for 40 yards. He stopped, stared, because what she whispered wasn't a command a civilian nurse would ever know. If this story already has you holding your breath, stay with me. Like this video, subscribe and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The wheel on Mara Bennett's carry-on had been broken for 6 weeks. She kept meaning to replace the bag. She kept not doing it. Every time she stood in the luggage section of a Target or a TJ Maxx, something in her would look at the prices, $40, $60, $80, and calculate what else that money could do. Student loan interest, the electric bill, the copay she still owed from January. She'd drag the bag back to her apartment with the broken wheel clicking against every sidewalk crack, and she'd tell herself next month. It was clicking now, louder than usual against the polished floors of Denver International's Concourse B, and Mara was already late, already irritated, already running the math of whether the gate would still be open. She had a nursing conference in Phoenix, 2 days of continuing education credits she needed to keep her license current, and she'd miscalculated the parking shuttle timing by 15 minutes. She wasn't the type of person who miscalculated. That was the part that annoyed her most. She moved fast, the way she always moved, not quite running, but with her shoulders dropped and her stride long and her eyes already mapping the terminal ahead for the fastest line through the crowd. Old habit. She didn't think about where it came from anymore. Mara was 32, white, narrow through the jaw, with the kind of face that people sometimes described as serious when they meant intimidating. She had close-cropped dark hair she kept that way because it was practical, not because she cared about the look of it. She wore scrubs to the airport because she'd come straight from a morning shift at Riverside Memorial and hadn't had time to change. And she was dimly aware that she looked like a woman who was either very tired or very focused, and either way, people tended to step out of her path. She had worked for 8 months at Riverside Memorial Hospital in Denver. Floor nurse, cardiac step-down unit. Before that, before she showed up in Colorado with a nursing license, 2 duffel bags, and a reference letter from a hospital in Virginia that no one had bothered to verify beyond a phone call, there wasn't much on paper. She preferred it that way. The conference was in Phoenix, 2 nights at a hotel she'd picked because it was the cheapest one within walking distance of the convention center. She had a seat in 24C, middle row, and she'd downloaded 2 podcasts and a novel she'd been meaning to read since March. She was thinking about whether she'd remembered to pack her phone charger when the leash snapped. She didn't hear it at first. What she heard was the sound of a crowd separating, that particular rush of bodies moving sideways, the gasp and scatter that happens when something large and fast is coming through. Her head came up automatically. The dog was 40 feet away and closing at a dead run. Belgian Malinois. Male. Maybe 75, 80 pounds. Lean the way working dogs are lean, all muscle over a light frame, with the driven, forward-pitched posture of an animal that had never in its life done anything casually. His ears were flat, his paws barely touching the floor between strides, and there was a handler behind him, young, military-cut, army green, who was running hard and already losing. Mara had maybe 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, several things happened at once. Her carry-on stopped mid-roll as she released the handle. Her weight shifted back and then deliberately down, not stumbling, not retreating, but sinking, knees hitting the floor in a controlled drop that cleared her center of gravity and opened her body into a shape the dog would recognize. Because she recognized the dog. Not his face. She couldn't have told you that in the moment, not consciously, not with certainty. What she recognized was something else. The movement. The way he ran with his head up instead of tracking low. The way his ears came forward when he got within 10 feet of her, switching from flat pursuit to something that looked almost like relief. Her left hand came up, palm out, not flinching, presenting. Atlas, sitz, German, military precision. 2 words in a register so specific, pitched low, clipped short, command flat rather than request soft, that they came from somewhere older than the past 8 months. The dog hit the brakes. His haunches dropped. He slid the last 3 feet on the polished airport floor and came to a stop with his nose 6 inches from her palm, sitting perfectly square. His dark eyes locked onto her face with an intensity that was almost painful to look at. The terminal was quiet. Not actually quiet. Denver International is never quiet. But the immediate bubble around them had gone still, in the way that crowds go still when they don't understand what they just witnessed. The handler stopped running, stood there, chest heaving, one hand on his knee. He was 23, maybe 24, and he was staring at Mara the way people stare at things they don't have a category for. Behind him, a second man had stopped walking, older, mid-50s. Army service dress, silver at the temples. 2 stars on his shoulder that Mara clocked without meaning to. He wasn't running. He'd been watching from 30 feet back, apparently content to let the younger soldier chase the dog, and now he was standing very still with his hands loose at his sides and an expression on his face that she could only describe as recognition. Not of her face. Something else. She became aware all at once that she was on her knees in the middle of a crowded airport in her scrubs, with one hand extended toward an 80-pound military dog who was staring at her like she'd hung the moon, and that the phone camera count in her peripheral vision was somewhere around 7 and climbing. She stood up, slowly, kept her voice flat. "He needs water," she said to the young handler. "He's panting shallow. Look at his sides. Probably been in a vehicle for a while." The handler blinked. "Ma'am, How did you—" "You're welcome," she said, and picked up her carry-on handle. She made it 6 steps before the older officer spoke. "Sergeant Bennett." She stopped. Not because she had to, because something in her body stopped before she told it to. She turned, looked at him. He wasn't smiling. His face had the careful blankness of a man who had spent decades learning to reveal nothing, and he was watching her with eyes that had done the math and arrived somewhere she didn't want him to arrive. "I think you have me confused with someone," she said. "You gave him the Schutzhund command," he said quietly. "Sitz, not sit. And you pitched it exactly right. Tone, duration. That's not something you pick up from YouTube." "I volunteered with the dog rescue," she said, "for a while." It was the answer she'd prepared. She had answers prepared for most of the questions. She'd had 8 months to prepare them. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Atlas, who had not moved from his sitting position, who was still watching Mara with the fixed attention of a dog waiting for the next command. "That's Atlas," the officer said. "He's been with the 3rd Support Battalion for 8 months. Prior to that, he was classified, part of a unit whose records I cannot discuss in this terminal." He paused. "He's been difficult to work with since the transfer. Reactive. Wouldn't hold commands. We had 2 handlers request reassignment." Mara said nothing. "He responds to you," the officer said, "like he's been waiting." "Dogs are unpredictable," she said. "Not Atlas." He held her gaze. "Never Atlas." She picked up her bag and walked away. So, her name, before it was Mara Bennett, had been Sergeant First Class Mara Voss. The name change was legal. So was everything else that had happened 2 years ago, when she walked out of a military hospital in Germany with a medical separation and a packet of documents she wasn't supposed to discuss. She had a new Social Security paper trail, a nursing license she'd earned legitimately through an accelerated program at Georgetown's Civilian Nursing Bridge course, and a reference letter from Walter Reed's civilian nursing staff, who knew her as Mara Bennett and nothing else. The people who had arranged all of this, the attorneys, the JAG officer, the woman in civilian clothes who'd sat across from her in a fluorescent conference room and explained, in very measured language, what her options were, had been clear about one thing above all else. She was done. The record was sealed. The identity was established. If she went back, if she opened that door, there was no protection on the other side of it. She had understood. She had signed what they asked her to sign, and she'd spent 8 months being very, very good at being nobody. Riverside Memorial was a good hospital, not the best in Denver. That was probably University Hospital, but competent, busy, and understaffed enough that a nurse who showed up on time didn't complain and could run a code without shaking was worth her weight in scheduling flexibility. She worked the cardiac step-down unit, which meant patients who'd come off the ICU but weren't stable enough for the floor. 12-hour shifts, usually nights. She had 2 coworkers she'd call friends. Darcy, who was 51 and had been nursing since before Mara was born, and who brought homemade tamales to every holiday potluck, and a travel nurse named Priya, who was only at Riverside for a 13-week contract, and who was currently in a complicated situation involving a boyfriend in Seattle and a lease in Phoenix. She had a studio apartment in Globeville, which was close to the highway and not particularly charming, but which she kept clean. She had a gym membership she used 4 mornings a week. She had a cat named Ridgeline who was missing half his left ear and who regarded her with the particular contempt of a cat that knows you need him more than he needs you. She had not, in 8 months, told a single person anything real about herself. She walked through Denver International's Concourse B, dragging her broken-wheeled bag, and she told herself she had handled it fine. The officer didn't know her name, not really. He'd said a name that didn't belong to her anymore, and she'd denied it, and she'd walked away. She told herself that. Her gate was already boarding Group 3. She got in line, scanned her boarding pass, found 24C and sat down and shoved the bag under the seat in front of her and pulled out her phone and opened the podcast app and did everything a person does when they are trying to behave normally on an airplane. The middle seat was empty. The window seat had a man in his 60s who smelled like cedar and was already asleep before the boarding door closed. She put her earbuds in. The podcast was about the history of the Transcontinental Railroad. It was exactly as boring and calming as she'd chosen it to be. She was fine. Well, Phoenix in March was warm in the way Denver almost never was. A dry warmth that reminded her of places she'd been that she didn't let herself think about. She took the hotel shuttle from Sky Harbor, checked in, and spent the first evening in her room with room service pasta and the novel she'd downloaded, and she almost managed not to think about the dog. Atlas. She had known it was him. She'd known it from the moment the crowd separated, and she saw the shape of him coming. Not rationally. She hadn't had time for rational. But in the way you know the weight of something you've carried before, even when you're not carrying it. She had deployed with Atlas for 11 months. That was the number. 11 months in a classified support unit attached to a joint special operations task force in a theater she couldn't name, in a role that officially didn't exist, doing work that was never going to appear on a DD-214 or a citation or anything that could be read at a congressional hearing without classification review. Her specialty had been emergency trauma, the kind that happens in the 30 seconds between a device detonating and a medevac arriving, the kind where you use what you have and make decisions that nobody second guesses until they're safe and warm. And the guy you saved is in a hospital bed instead of bleeding out in a ditch. She had trained for years to be fast and accurate and not afraid of the scale of what could go wrong. The K9 integration had come later. The unit had started embedding medical personnel with handler teams, which meant learning the dogs, their commands, their stress indicators, how to move with them in confined spaces, how to treat them when they were hit. She'd taken to it faster than expected. The handlers had joked that Atlas liked her better than them, which was funny until it was true. And then the mission. She did not let herself think about the mission. Not in Phoenix, not anywhere. That particular door she had welded shut 27 months ago, and she had been disciplined about it ever since. The novel was about a woman rebuilding her life on a farm in Vermont. It was not a very good novel, but it was uncomplicated and it asked nothing of her, and she read it until 11 and then turned the light off and lay in the dark with the air conditioner running and told herself to sleep. She slept 4 hours. Woke up at 0300 out of habit she still hadn't broken, lay there listening to Phoenix being quiet, and was at the hotel gym by 0338. The conference ran 2 days. She attended the sessions she needed for credits, sepsis management updates, new documentation requirements, a panel on nursing workforce retention that made her feel something she chose not to examine, and she ate lunch alone because she was better at that than the alternative. On the second afternoon, she was in a session on cardiac arrhythmia management when her phone buzzed. Text from Darcy. Call me when you're out of whatever you're in. Not an emergency, just call me. She stepped out into the hallway. Darcy picked up on the second ring. Okay, Darcy said. This is a weird one, and I don't know if it's connected to anything, but there were 2 men here this morning asking about you. Mara went still. At the hospital? At the nurse's station, when I came on at 7. Apparently they'd been there for a while. Tomas said they showed up around 6:30. They had ID, military, but Tomas said they weren't in uniform. What did they ask? Your schedule? Whether you were on this week? How long you'd worked here? A pause. Mara, who are these people? What kind of ID? He said one of them had a DOD badge, but he didn't get the full name. The other one didn't show ID at all, just let the first one do the talking. Darcy's voice was careful now, the way it got when she was being tactful. Honey, is there something going on? Because if you need... I'm fine, Mara said. I'm sorry you had to deal with that. If they come back, tell them you don't have my schedule available and they'll need to contact HR. Mara. I'm fine, Darcy. She hung up, stood in the conference center hallway for a moment with her phone in her hand and her pulse doing something it hadn't done in 8 months. They'd been fast. She'd been in Phoenix for less than 48 hours, and they'd already sent people to her hospital. She ran the logic. The officer at the airport, 2 stars, the kind of rank that doesn't chase things personally, the kind of rank that picks up a phone, had made a call. The call had gone to someone who knew where to look. 8 months ago, when she'd been placed, the people who set up her identity had believed it was solid. And it probably was solid. She'd done nothing to break it, except use Atlas's command in front of 200 people and a general. She went back into the session, sat down, took notes on QT interval prolongation because she was a professional and the credits were not going to earn themselves. But she was already calculating. She landed back in Denver on a Thursday evening, March air sharper than Phoenix's, the mountains visible to the west in the last light. She took the shuttle to the parking lot, loaded her bag into her car, and drove back to Globeville. Ridgeline was indignant about the 2-day absence. She fed him, changed his water, and stood at her kitchen window for a while looking at nothing. She had thought sometimes that this was what the rest of her life would look like. Quiet. Functional. A good job that used real skills. A city she didn't hate. A routine that kept the worst parts of her brain occupied. Not happy exactly, but not the other thing either. The men at the hospital had not gone away. Darcy texted her that they'd come back Thursday afternoon, same too, and this time they'd asked to speak with hospital administration. The charge nurse on the floor, a man named Keith, who was not Darcy and was not known for discretion, had apparently told them that Mara was returning from a conference that evening. She did not allow herself to be angry about that, because anger was not useful right now. She slept 3 hours. Was back at the hospital at 0600 for her Friday shift. The 2 men were in the lobby. She clocked them before she got through the automatic doors. Civilian clothes, pressed khaki, dark jackets, but with the posture and the stillness of people who spent their days waiting in places they were not comfortable being waited in. The taller one was watching the entrance. When she walked in, his eyes went to her ID badge, then to her face, with the systematic efficiency of someone who had been given a photograph. She kept walking. Ms. Bennett, he stepped into her path. Not aggressively, but firmly. I'm Agent Donahue, Defense Department Inspector General's office. He showed a badge quickly, the practiced motion. We'd like a few minutes. I have a shift starting in 8 minutes, she said. We'll be brief. You've been here twice. That's not brief. She looked at him steadily. If you want to speak with me, make an appointment through the hospital's administrative contact process. That's the appropriate channel. It's not a legal matter, the second man said. He was shorter, older, with the specifically careful tone of someone trying to de-escalate a situation before it starts. We're not here to create a problem for you. Then you should have no trouble making an appointment. She stepped around them. Sergeant Voss? The name landed in her chest like a hammer. She kept walking, did not stop, did not turn. But her hands, at her sides, had gone very still. The way hands go still when everything else in the body is working very hard to do something other than what it wants to do. She pushed through the doors to the stairwell, walked up to the 3rd floor, clocked in at 0601, 1 minute early, and went to receive report from the night nurse. Her hands were steady by the time she got to the unit. She was that good at this. The shift was hard. In the way cardiac step-down shifts are hard. Not dramatic, not bloody, just relentlessly demanding. The kind of nursing where you are thinking about 6 people simultaneously and managing their conflicting needs across 12 hours without anyone dying of something preventable. She had a patient in 312, Mr. Alvarado, 78, 2 days post-cardiac cath, who was intermittently confused and kept trying to remove his monitoring leads. She had a patient in 308 who'd had a run of PVCs overnight that nobody had told the attending about yet, which meant she was on the phone by 0700. She had a new admission coming from the ICU at 0900. She did not think about the men in the lobby. She did not think about the name they'd used. At 1100, Keith, the charge nurse, appeared at the nurse's station doorway with the expression of a man who had made a decision he wasn't sure about. Mara, there's the 2 men who came yesterday. Administration let them use the conference room. They're asking if you'll meet with them on your lunch break. He paused. You don't have to. It's completely voluntary. But they did mention something about, I didn't quite follow it, but they said it was important. Something about records. What records? They didn't say. She looked at Keith. He was a competent charge nurse and a mediocre human being, and he had given her location information to 2 federal agents, which she would address another time. I'll take lunch at 12:30, she said. She did not go to the conference room at 12:30. At 12:10, she was in the 3rd floor break room eating a sandwich and checking her phone when she heard, over the hospital's overhead PA system, a sound that stopped her mid-bite. A dog. Not a bark. A specific vocalization, high and short and interrogative. The sound a Malinois makes when it's searching and it's getting close. She was up and moving before she'd processed why. The sound came again. Then a 3rd time, more urgent. She was already through the break room door and into the hallway when she heard the commotion ahead. Voices. The scrape of a cart. Someone saying, "Sir, you cannot bring that animal." And she came around the corner at the junction of halls B and C and stopped. The 2 men from the lobby were there, and next to them, on a short lead, sat Atlas. He was in a tactical vest. His ears were up, and the moment he saw her, 20 feet down the corridor, still holding half a sandwich, every line of his body changed. He stood, pulled. The shorter agent held the lead and said something sharp, and Atlas sat again, but his eyes were locked on Mara with an intensity that made the air feel different. We thought, Donahue said carefully, watching her face, that this might be a better conversation than the one we've been trying to have. Mara looked at Atlas. Atlas looked at Mara. 8 months. She took 3 steps forward, crouched down, let him come to her hands. He pressed his face into her palm like he was trying to make sure she was real, and she felt something crack open in her chest that she had been very careful not to let crack open, and she closed her hand around his jaw and held it there. Okay, she said quietly. Not to the agents, to herself. Okay. She stood, looked at Donahue. You have 20 minutes, she said, and then I have to finish my shift. Conference room on the 2nd floor of Riverside Memorial was used mostly for family meetings and the occasional performance review, and it smelled like dry erase markers and bad coffee. Someone had left a whiteboard half covered in care coordination notes that nobody had bothered to erase. The overhead light flickered once when Mara sat down and then held. She had exactly 20 minutes. She intended to use 17 of them listening and 3 of them leaving. Donahue set a thin folder on the table but didn't open it. The shorter agent, he'd introduced himself as Reeves, no first name offered, sat against the wall rather than at the table, which told her something about which of them was actually running this. Atlas lay down beside her chair without being told. We're not here to threaten your civilian life, Donahue started. Then what are you here to do? We're here because there's an active investigation into what happened to the 114th. She kept her face neutral. The 114th. She hadn't heard that designation spoken aloud in 27 months. It landed in the room like something dropped from a height. I don't know what that refers to, she said. Reeves, from his chair against the wall, made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Ms. Bennett, you controlled that dog in a crowded airport with a Schutzen Phase 3 command in a dialect specific to the 114th's handler protocol. You want to tell me you learned that at a rescue shelter? She looked at him. He looked back, unbothered. General Harwick was there, Donahue said. At the airport. He's the one who sent us. That landed differently. She'd made the officer as a general. 2 stars, she'd counted, but she hadn't known his name. Harwick. She ran it back through what she remembered and found it. faint and distant, attached to a briefing she'd attended in a forward operating base in a country she'd signed papers not to name. General Harwick, she said carefully, should know that whatever he thinks he saw at that airport, he's mistaken. He's not mistaken, Reeves said, and he knows he's not mistaken, and we both know you know he's not mistaken. He said it without heat, just the flat patience of a man who has held this conversation before and is prepared to hold it again as many times as it takes. What he doesn't know, what we don't know, is why your record was sealed the way it was. Because the paperwork on your separation doesn't match what we're finding in the 114th's operational files. Mara looked at the folder on the table. She didn't touch it. What kind of mismatch? Donahue finally opened the folder. He turned it to face her and slid it across. The top sheet was a JAG summary, redacted in several places, but enough visible that she could read the conclusion paragraph. Separation determined to be voluntary under medical grounds. Service records sealed per classified unit protocol. No outstanding charges or disciplinary actions at time of separation. She read it twice. That's what's in your file, Donahue said, as of 27 months ago. That seems accurate, she said. The problem, Reeves said from his chair, is that we've been pulling the 114th's operational records as part of a separate investigation. And there are 3 incident reports from your last deployment that aren't in your file. They reference you by name, by rank, and they describe actions that don't align with a voluntary medical separation. She put the paper down. What kind of actions? She said, very quietly. Donahue said, the kind that would have resulted in a commendation. Well, she made it back to the unit with 4 minutes to spare before the end of her theoretical lunch break, which meant she'd been gone for 26 minutes instead of 20, and Keith gave her a look she ignored. Mr. Alvarado in 312 had pulled his leads again. The patient in 308 had been cleared by the attending and was being moved to a step-down room on 4. The new admission from the ICU had arrived and was a 63-year-old woman named Dorothy Fassbender, who was post-ablation, oriented ×3, and who looked at Mara with the precise, evaluating gaze of a woman who had spent 63 years deciding who was worth trusting. You look like something's eating at you, Mrs. Fassbender said, approximately 30 seconds after Mara started her admission assessment. I'm fine, Mara said, wrapping the blood pressure cuff. Sure you are. Mrs. Fassbender settled back against her pillow. I was a family court judge for 22 years. I know the face people make when they're holding something they don't know what to do with. Mara pumped the cuff, watched the gauge. Blood pressure's good, 118/74. You don't have to tell me, the woman said. I'm just noting it. Mara documented the number, moved on to heart rate, and spent the next 8 minutes completing the admission without volunteering a single thing. Mrs. Fassbender watched her the entire time with the comfortable patience of someone who understood that silence was sometimes the most telling answer available. Outside the room, in the hallway, Mara stood for a moment and looked at nothing. A commendation. She had been told, in the fluorescent conference room, by the woman in civilian clothes, that the incident reports had been processed, that her role had been documented as ancillary, that the operation's outcome had been classified and the findings sealed. She had been told that her separation was the cleanest option for everyone, including her. She had been told that opening the record would create legal exposure she didn't want, and institutional complications that nobody had the bandwidth to navigate. She had believed them because she'd had a concussion and 3 cracked ribs, and she'd been in a German military hospital for 11 days, and she hadn't slept more than 4 hours at a stretch in the preceding 3 weeks. And sometimes you believe people when you're too tired to fight. She had not, until this moment in a hospital hallway in Denver, considered that the people telling her those things might have been wrong or lying. She left Atlas with the agents. They'd arranged to meet her after her shift ended at 1900 and got through the rest of the day on the autopilot that very good nurses develop over years of needing to be both present and functional in the middle of their own falling apart. At 1845, 15 minutes before she was scheduled to clock out, her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. Don't meet with Donahue again without a lawyer. This isn't what they're telling you it is. I'll explain. She stared at the text, typed back, who is this? 3 dots. Then, someone who was there. Then nothing. She waited 40 seconds. Typed, there where? No response. She clocked out at 19:01, 1 minute late, and went to find the agents. They were in the hospital's main lobby, Atlas in his vest, Donahue on his phone, Reeves sitting with the particular stillness of a man conserving energy. When she came through the stairwell door, Atlas's head came up immediately. "Walk with me," she said. They went outside. Denver in March at 7 in the evening was cold enough to see breath, the sky that specific dark blue that comes just before full dark. She walked them to a bench near the parking structure that was out of the hospital's camera sightlines. She'd noted the camera positions in her first week at Riverside, which she understood was not normal nursing behavior, but which she had never been able to stop herself from doing. "The incident reports," she said. "How many people know they exist?" "Currently?" Donahue thought about it. "Harwick, us, 2 analysts at the IG office, and whoever sealed them originally." "Who sealed them?" He and Reeves exchanged a look. "That's part of what we're investigating," Reeves said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one we have right now." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on knees. The authorization came from inside the 114th's command structure, but the unit was decommissioned 14 months ago, and the officer who signed the orders has since retired to private sector. She thought about the text. Someone who was there. "What was the commendation for?" she asked. Donahue opened his mouth. Reeves put a hand up, a slight, flat gesture, and Donahue closed it again. "We'd like you to come in," Reeves said, "formally, with whatever legal representation you want present, and we'd like to walk you through what we've found in a secure environment. I'm not going anywhere formally until I know what I'm walking into." "That's fair. So tell me what the commendation was for." A pause. Reeves looked at Atlas, who was sitting between them, still watching Mara. Something shifted in his expression that she couldn't read. "It was for pulling 4 soldiers and 1 K9 out of a structure that was on fire," he said, "under active fire, after your team's cover had been compromised." He paused. The K9 was Atlas. The bench was cold under her hands. "The report says you carried Atlas out yourself," Donahue said quietly now. "He'd taken fragment damage to his left foreleg. You'd taken a round to your right side, and you still made 2 trips back into the building." She didn't say anything. "The men you pulled out are alive," Reeves said. "All 4 of them. They've been interviewed as part of this investigation. They've confirmed everything in the report." She looked at Atlas. He looked back at her, and his tail moved once, slowly, the way dogs do when they're not excited, but they're certain. "Someone made sure none of that was in your file," Donahue said. "Someone took the incident reports out of the official record, flagged your separation as voluntary, and sealed your identity. We want to know who, and we think you might know things that can help us get there." She was quiet for a long moment. The parking structure hummed. Somewhere on the street beyond the hospital grounds, a truck downshifted. "I got a text tonight," she said, "from someone who said they were there, said I shouldn't talk to you without a lawyer, said this isn't what you're telling me it is." She looked at Reeves. "Do you know who that is?" Reeves's face did something careful. "What did the text say exactly?" She showed him her phone. He read it, showed it to Donahue without comment, handed it back. "We'd like a copy of that," he said. "I'd like to know if I'm being played from 2 directions simultaneously." "That's a reasonable concern." "That's not an answer either." He looked at her for a moment. "There is a person," he said slowly, "who was part of the 114th's command structure and who we believe has been aware of this investigation for approximately 3 weeks. We don't know whether that person is trying to help you or trying to control what you say to us." He paused. "We don't fully trust them, and you shouldn't either." "Initial for the first name," she said. He hesitated. "T." She sat with that. T. She turned through the people she'd known in the 114th, people whose first names started with T, and found 2. One was dead. She'd been told that much, at the hospital in Germany. The other was a warrant officer named Tolliver, Gabe Tolliver, a handler and tactical coordinator who had been on the same operation, who she'd last seen going through a doorway with 2 of the 4 soldiers she'd later carried out of a burning building. She had not known, for 27 months, whether Gabe Tolliver was alive. "I need to go home," she said. "Ms. Bennett, I'll meet with you. With a lawyer. I need 24 hours to find one, and I need time to think." She stood. "Don't come back to my hospital." She walked to her car. She sat in it for 4 minutes without starting it, hands on the wheel, not shaking, but close enough that she pressed her palms flat against the leather until the feeling passed. Then she drove home. Ridgeline was on the kitchen counter when she got in, which he knew perfectly well he wasn't allowed to be, and he watched her with the absolute zero remorse of a cat who has made his calculations and found them satisfying. She moved him to the floor, washed her hands, put water on for tea she wasn't going to drink, and sat at her kitchen table with her phone in front of her. She typed, "Are you Tolliver?" The response came in under 2 minutes. "Yes." She sat with that for a moment. Then, "I was told you were dead." "I know. I was told the same about you. Ours were not the only files that got altered." She pressed her thumb against the edge of the table hard enough to feel it. "What do you want?" she typed. "To tell you what they aren't going to tell you. The investigation Donahue is running is real. But it's not the whole picture. There's a second file, not the incident reports, something older, pre-deployment. It connects to why the mission went wrong, and it connects to a name that Reeves hasn't mentioned to you because he's not authorized to yet." "What name?" A longer pause this time. 30 seconds. 40. Colonel Devin Marsh. She did not know that name. She typed, "I don't recognize that. You wouldn't. He wasn't 114th. He was above it. He's the one who issued the order that compromised the operation. And he's the one who signed the authorization to seal everything afterward, including your record, including mine. Where is he now?" "That's the problem," Tolliver wrote. "He retired 8 months ago. Private sector. Defense contracting. He has lawyers and money and a lot of reasons to make sure this investigation stays narrow." A pause. "And he knows it's active. Someone told him 3 weeks ago." She read the last message twice. Someone inside the investigation. Someone who had told a retired colonel that his buried decisions were being exhumed. "Why are you telling me this?" she typed. "Because I've been trying to get someone to listen for 14 months, and nobody at the IG level believes a warrant officer over a colonel without corroboration. Your corroboration. You were there. You have standing that I don't." Another pause. "And because you deserve to know your name was taken from you deliberately." She set the phone down. She looked at her kitchen ceiling, at the water beginning to steam on the stove, at Ridgeline, who had returned to the counter while she wasn't watching and was now sitting beside the kettle with the triumphant composure of an animal who has never once accepted a boundary he found inconvenient. She thought about Atlas pressing his face into her palm in the hallway. 8 months of him being difficult, refusing commands, 2 handlers requesting reassignment, not because he was broken, because he'd been waiting for a context that made sense, a person whose commands matched the ones burned into his training, and he'd been asked to work for people who weren't that, and he hadn't been able to pretend otherwise. She had spent 8 months being very good at pretending otherwise. She picked up the phone. "I need everything you have," she typed. "Documents, dates, whatever you've kept." "I've kept everything," he replied. "I wasn't going to let them make it disappear." "Can we meet?" "That's where it gets complicated," he wrote. "I'm currently in Denver." She stared at the screen. "I've been here for 6 days," he wrote. "I followed the investigation. I didn't know you were here until the airport incident got flagged in the system, and then I realized—" He stopped mid-sentence, started again. "Mara, there's something else." "What?" "Marsh knows you're here. Not because of the airport. Before that. Someone ran your nursing license against a database 3 weeks ago, and the query went through a channel that Marsh still has access to." She felt the shift before she understood it. Some animal part of her that had been trained for years to recognize when a situation had changed, when something had moved from background threat to immediate. "He's known where I am for 3 weeks," she typed. "Yes. And the IG investigation went active how long ago?" 4 weeks. She stood up. The water was boiling. She turned off the stove and moved to the window and looked at the street below. The familiar block, the familiar cars parked in the familiar spots, the 2 cars she didn't recognize, one of which had been there when she arrived home and one of which had not. The second car's engine was still warm. She could see it, faintly, in the March cold, the heat shimmer rising off the hood. Someone was sitting in it. She stepped back from the window, picked up her phone and typed one word to Tolliver, "Now." His response came in 4 seconds. "I know. Back exit. Blue Honda. 2 streets over. Don't bring anything you can't carry. She was already moving. She grabbed her jacket off the hook by the door, her phone, her wallet, the spare key she kept taped inside the cabinet above the refrigerator, the one she'd put there in her first week at the apartment because old habits don't ask permission. And she was out the back stairwell in under 90 seconds. Ridgeline watched her go from the counter with the expression of a cat who had seen stranger things and expected to see stranger still. The back exit of her building led out onto an alley that ran between her block and the next, and March in Globeville at night was dark enough and cold enough that the alley was empty, which was what she needed. She moved fast, not running. Running draws eyes, but with the long, purposeful stride of someone who is going somewhere they are supposed to be. She turned left at the alley's end, came out onto the parallel street, and found the blue Honda exactly where Tolliver said it would be. She got in. Gabe Tolliver was thinner than she remembered. He'd always been lean, but there was a different quality to it now. The kind of thin that comes from a long time of not quite having enough, or not quite caring enough to make sure you do. He was 36, dark-complexioned, with the slightly uneven jaw of a man who'd broken it once and hadn't had it set perfectly. He was looking at her with the particular expression of someone who has been rehearsing this moment for longer than they expected to wait. "You look the same," he said. "You don't," she said. "Drive." He drove. He didn't ask where. He took them northwest, away from her neighborhood, through the light industrial blocks that border the river on the city's west side. And neither of them said anything for the first 4 minutes because there was too much and they were both, in their separate ways, people who needed a moment to find the right place to start. Tolliver started. "How much did Donahue tell you?" "The incident reports, the commendation. 4 soldiers and 1 K9. She paused. "He told me you'd been interviewed." "I have, twice. Under oath, with a JAG attorney present." He checked his mirror out of habit. "They're not running a bad investigation. Donahue is clean. I've looked at him. Reeves I'm less sure about, but I think that's personal style more than anything structural." "Then why did you tell me not to talk to them?" "Because I needed you to hear Marsh's name from me first, not from them. Because the way they're going to present him to you, as a retired officer with potential liability, is going to undersell what he actually did." His jaw tightened. "Marsh didn't make a bad call on the operation, Mara. He made a deliberate one. There's a difference." She looked out the window. Denver's west side passed in the particular indifferent way that industrial neighborhoods pass at night. Loading docks, chain link, the occasional lit window of a business that keeps late hours. "What's the second file?" she said. "Pre-deployment planning. Marsh was running a parallel operation through a contractor, a defense tech company called Veritas Group. They had a contract to test a specific remote monitoring system in a live operational environment. Our mission was the environment." He said it flatly, without drama, the way you say things you've had a long time to get used to being angry about. "We weren't told. The system had a vulnerability that their own engineers had flagged internally 3 weeks before deployment. Marsh signed off anyway because the contract had a performance deadline." She was quiet. "The compromise," she said. "That's what it was. The vulnerability exposed our communication frequency. 40 minutes into the operation." He stopped at a light. "They knew we were there before we were in position. She had known, in the building, that something had gone wrong with the communications. She had known, in the way you know things in the field, that the situation had shifted from controlled to reactive faster than any tactical error should have allowed. She had not known why, not specifically. She'd been too busy keeping people alive to diagnose the cause. "How long have you known this?" she said. 14 months. "And you've been trying to get someone to listen." "Yes." His voice didn't change, but something behind it did. "A warrant officer with a sealed record accusing a retired colonel with defense contractor connections of deliberately compromising a classified operation. You can imagine how those conversations went." She could. "Why didn't you find me sooner?" she said. "I didn't know if you were alive for the first 8 months." He glanced at her. "Your record said voluntary medical separation. Mine said the same. Neither of us had a way to contact the other through official channels because officially neither of us was attached to the 114th anymore." A pause. "And I wasn't sure when I found out you were in Denver whether you'd want to be found." She didn't answer that because the honest answer was that she wasn't sure either. "The documents," she said. What do you actually have?" copies of the pre-deployment planning files with Marsh's signature on the contractor approval, the Veritas Group internal engineering memo flagging the vulnerability. I got that through a source I'm not going to name. 3 sworn statements from soldiers who were there, 2 of whom have also spoken to the IG. He reached into the back seat without taking his eyes off the road and dropped a padded envelope on her lap. And the original incident report, the real one, not the version that disappeared from your file. She held the envelope. Where did you get this? From the officer who wrote it. He said it slowly. Major Louise Ferron. She was the 114th Senior Medical Officer. She submitted that report through proper channels 11 days after the operation. 3 weeks later, she was transferred to a desk position at Fort Bliss and told her promotion review had been delayed indefinitely. He paused. She kept a copy. She gave it to me 8 months ago. Is she part of the investigation? She's the reason the investigation exists. She went to the IG 14 months ago. That's what started it. A beat. She wasn't believed immediately either, but she had the document. Mara opened the envelope. She didn't read it by the window light. They were moving and the light was wrong. But she could see the header, the date, the signature block at the bottom. She recognized the format. She recognized her own name in the body text, 3rd paragraph, 1st line. SFC Voss, Mara A. Conducted evacuation of 4 personnel and 1 K9 asset under direct fire conditions. She closed the envelope. Okay, she said, the same word she'd said in the hospital hallway with Atlas's face in her hand. Same word, different weight. There's one more thing, Tolliver said. Of course there is. Marsh isn't just monitoring the investigation. His legal team filed a motion 2 days ago to have the pre-deployment files reclassified under a national security exemption. If that motion goes through, Ferron's document becomes inadmissible, the engineering memo becomes inadmissible, and the investigation effectively hits a wall. When is the ruling? 72 hours. She held the envelope in her lap and looked at the city going past. Then we have 72 hours, she said. They went to Tolliver's motel, which was the kind of place that takes cash and doesn't ask questions, out near the junction of I-70 and Sheridan, with a heating unit that worked intermittently and a deadbolt that she tested twice. He'd been living out of a duffel bag for 6 days. The room smelled like takeout containers and the particular staleness of a person who's been surviving rather than inhabiting. She laid the documents from the envelope on the bed and read them properly. It took 40 minutes. She read slowly, which people who knew her in a clinical context found surprising. She moved fast in crisis, but with documents she went line by line, the way her first field supervisor had taught her, because the thing that kills you is always the thing you skimmed. The incident report was 22 pages. Ferron had written it with the careful precision of a senior medical officer who knew she was building a record, not just filing paperwork. Every action was time-stamped. Every personnel decision was attributed. The medical interventions Mara had performed were described with clinical specificity: chest seals, tourniquet placement, the field treatment for Atlas's leg wound, the medications she'd administered from her kit, the sequence of the evacuation. There was a section about the building's 2nd floor. She read it twice. She had not until that moment known that a 5th person had been in the building. The report described him as Warrant Officer G. Tolliver, who was located by SFC Voss in a 2nd-floor room and carried from the structure prior to structural collapse. She looked up from the paper. Tolliver was sitting in the room's single chair with his elbows on his knees and his hands loose, watching her. "You carried me out," he said. "You didn't know if I was dead." "You weren't dead," she said. "I had a head injury. I was non-responsive." "Non-responsive isn't dead." She looked back at the paper. "I'm in the report as carrying Atlas and then going back for the 2nd sweep." "You're on the 2nd sweep." She turned a page. Ferron clocked it at 6 minutes. "I know. I've read it. 6 minutes in an active structure, with a round in my side and a dog under one arm." She said it without pride, just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that had happened. No wonder they didn't want it on record. A commendation for that would have required a full review of the operation. Full review of the operation would have surfaced the contractor. Contractor surfaces and Marsh is looking at a congressional inquiry, not a retirement package. She set the papers down and pressed the heel of her hand against her eyes for a moment. "Ferron's document is the anchor," she said. "If Marsh gets it reclassified, The IG can still proceed on the sworn statements, but it becomes a he said, she said against a man with significant institutional protection. The case doesn't collapse, but it slows down. Marcia's lawyers know that. Slow is almost as good as stopped for what they need. She thought about Reeves's careful face, Donahue's open folder. Donahue doesn't know about the reclassification motion, she said. He does now, Tolliver said. I sent him a message 2 hours ago. Whether he's moved on it yet. Her phone buzzed. She looked at the screen. Unknown number, but not the same unknown number as Tolliver's. Different last 4 digits. She answered. Ms. Bennett, Reeves's voice, flat and careful as always. We're aware of the motion Marcia's legal team filed. We've been in contact with the DOJ, and we have a response in process. How did you get this number? We're federal investigators. A pause that might, in someone else, have been a touch of dry humor. I need to ask you to come in tonight, not tomorrow, tonight. There's been a development that changes the timeline. What development? A pause, long enough that she could hear him making a decision. Marcia's lawyers have filed a supplemental motion, he said. It requests the personal medical records of all personnel involved in the operation, under the argument that disputed health-related separations are relevant to the classification review. She understood immediately what that meant and what it would expose and what it would allow Marcia's team to do with it. He's trying to access the records to see what we have, she said. He's trying to see whether Major Ferran's account aligns with the medical documentation that exists outside the classified system. If there's a discrepancy he can use, there isn't one, she said. Ferran's report is accurate. I know that, but if Marcia's team gets access to the medical records before we can formally enter Ferran's document into evidence, they can selectively frame the discrepancies in the public record before we can correct them. Another pause. Ms. Bennett, we need your formal statement, tonight. She looked at Tolliver. He was watching her. He'd heard enough. Send me an address, she said. We're both coming. The IG field office was in a federal building in downtown Denver, nondescript, the kind of place designed to look like nothing in particular. They were there by 11. Donahue met them in the lobby with the expression of a man who had not slept recently and was not expecting to. He looked at Tolliver and then back at Mara. You two have been in contact, he said. For about 4 hours, she said. He has documents you need to see. Donahue let them through. The next 3 hours were the most concentrated version of something Mara had spent 8 months trying not to think about. A conference room, this one larger and cleaner than Riverside's, with a recorder running and a JAG attorney present whose name was Hendricks, and who was younger than Mara expected, but clearly sharp. She gave her statement in the ordered, specific way she'd learned to document things in the field. Not a narrative, not an emotional account, but a sequence. This happened, then I made this decision for these reasons. She did not perform distress. She did not editorialize. She described the operation's timeline as she'd experienced it. The communications failure, the building, the people she'd moved, the medical interventions she'd made, and why. When she got to Atlas, she gave the same clinical specificity: traumatic fragment injury to the left distal foreleg, suspected hemorrhage, improvised pressure bandage from kit, carried in controlled hold to minimize movement. The JAG attorney was writing fast. Halfway through, Reeves came in and sat against the wall, and she saw something shift in his face when she got to the 5th evacuation, Tolliver, and the structural collapse that had happened approximately 90 seconds after she cleared the doorway with him. She did not look at Tolliver when she described that part. At 1:30 in the morning, Hendricks called a 15-minute break. Mara got coffee from a machine in the hallway that produced something technically in the coffee family, and she stood in the fluorescent hallway quiet and let herself be tired for a moment, just for a moment. Donahue appeared beside her. We have a problem, he said, low. Another one. Marcia's supplemental motion. It's been fast-tracked. Someone on the federal court side put it on an expedited review. We've pushed back through DOJ, but the ruling could come as early as tomorrow morning instead of 72 hours. She drank the bad coffee. What do you need from me before then? Everything you've given us tonight goes into a formal evidentiary package that we submit as a counter to the reclassification motion. We need it processed and certified before the ruling comes down. He paused. The problem is the medical records. Your record, as it currently stands, supports Marcia's version of events. Voluntary separation, No outstanding commendations, no documented combat injuries. Because it was altered. Yes, but proving it was altered means accessing the system that stores the original, the pre-alteration version. That system is classified. Getting authorized access on a compressed timeline. Ferran's report, she said. She documented the injuries, round to the right side. 2 cracked ribs from the structural movement when the floor went. That's in the incident report, which Marsh is trying to get reclassified. You have Tolliver's statement. You have the statements from the 4 soldiers. You have Ferran's document in your possession right now. We need the medical records to corroborate. Then get them, she said. I'm authorizing the release. Whatever form you need me to sign, I'll sign it. But don't tell me you need something and then list the reasons you can't get it. Find another way in. He looked at her. You're not what I expected, he said. I'm a nurse. I've been telling people bad news on a compressed timeline for 3 years. Get the paperwork. He got this paperwork. She signed it at 1:47 in the morning. Oh, they were done by 3. Donahue walked them out. In the lobby, Atlas was there. He'd been brought over at some point in the evening, was sitting with the younger handler from the airport, and when Mara came through the door, he was on his feet before she reached the midpoint of the lobby. She crouched. He came to her hands. She checked his left foreleg without thinking, a habit, running her fingers along the muscle above where the fragment damage had been, feeling for scar tissue the same way she'd checked it 100 times during the deployment. It was there, a thick cord of healed tissue along the lateral aspect of the leg. He let her check it, sat square, waited. He wouldn't let the vet near that leg for 6 months, the handler said quietly. Had to sedate him. She moved her hand to his neck. He pushed into it. I know, she said. Outside, Tolliver stood on the sidewalk in the cold with his hands in his jacket pockets and looked at the city. She came to stand beside him. How long before we know? He said. Donahue said they'll submit the package by 7 this morning. The ruling on the reclassification motion could come any time after 9. And if it goes Marsh's way anyway, then we figure out what's next. She looked at the street. But I don't think it will. That's optimistic for you. It's not optimism, she said. Ferran documented everything. The 4 soldiers gave statements. You have the engineering memo. I just gave 3 hours of testimony under oath and authorized the medical record release. She paused. An Atlas picked me out in a public airport in front of a 2-star general. That's not nothing. He almost smiled. Not quite. Go sleep somewhere, he said. We'll know in the morning. She went back to her apartment because the cars were gone, and whatever watching had been happening on her street had apparently concluded or shifted, and she fed Ridgeline, who was both furious and hungry and not interested in her excuses. She lay down on her bed at 3:40 in the morning and looked at the ceiling and told herself to sleep for 5 hours, which was both a plan and a negotiation with a version of herself that had a lot of things still running in the background, most of which did not know what to do with the information that Gabe Tolliver had been alive this whole time. She slept 4 hours, woke at 7:43, checked her phone. One message from Donahue. At 6:58 a.m., package submitted, counter motion filed, DOJ attorney joining for the hearing, will know by noon. One message from Tolliver, sent at 7:12. Marsh's legal team just added a new filing, requesting that any witness who served in the 114th under a protected identity be barred from testimony pending identity verification review. She read it twice. She was out of bed before she finished the second read, because that motion, if granted, would not just complicate her testimony. It would erase it. Tolliver's next message came in while she was pulling on her shoes. They know about Ferran's copy. Someone told them. Mara. Someone inside this investigation is feeding Marsh's team in real time. She stopped moving, sat there with one shoe on and one shoe off and her phone in her hand and the particular very cold feeling of a situation that has just revealed a new dimension it had been hiding. Donahue had the document. Reeves, Hendricks, the JAG attorney, the 2 analysts Reeves had mentioned. Any one of them could have made a call between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m. She typed back to Tolliver, does Donahue know? Sending him the filing now, he wrote. But Mara, if there's a leak, they're going to move the hearing up. Marsh's team will push to get the ruling before the DOJ attorney can arrive. She had her second shoe on. She typed, where are you? Lobby of the federal building. I came back at 6. Don't go in until I get there, she wrote, and call Ferran. Right now, she needs to know her copy may be compromised. She was already out the door. She was 3 blocks from her building, moving fast through the thin, cold morning when her phone rang. Not Tolliver, not Donahue. A number she didn't recognize. She answered because she'd learned, in the last 14 hours, that not answering things was a luxury she no longer had. The voice on the other end was male, older, measured in the specific way of a man who has spent a career being the person in the room with the most power, and who speaks slowly because he's never had to rush. "Sergeant Voss," the man said. "My name is Devin Marsh. I think it's time we spoke directly." She kept walking. Not because she wasn't rattled, she was in the specific, controlled way of someone whose threat assessment has just recalibrated, but because stopping on a sidewalk to take a call from the man who'd buried her record was exactly the kind of thing she wasn't going to do. She kept her stride, kept her voice even. "How did you get this number?" "The same way I know you were in that federal building until 3 this morning," Marsh said. "The same way I know Warrant Officer Tolliver has been in Denver for 6 days. I have people who are very good at their jobs, Sergeant. You should understand that before you decide how this conversation goes." "I'm not a sergeant anymore." "No, you're a nurse named Mara Bennett." A pause. "For now." She turned the corner onto a wider street. More people, more noise. "Better." "What do you want?" she said. "The same thing I've always wanted, a clean resolution." His voice had the specific patience of someone who genuinely believes they're the reasonable party in a situation they created. "You were given a clean exit, good paperwork, a new identity, a career path that suited your skills. I made sure that exit was functional. I could have made it much harder." "You're framing a cover-up as a favor." "I'm framing a difficult decision in its full context," he said. "The operation failed. People were at risk. Not just the people in that building, but the program, the unit, everyone connected to it. I made decisions to protect the larger structure. I'm not going to apologize for that." "You compromised the communication frequency to meet a contractor deadline," she said. "People almost died." A beat. "That's a significant allegation." "I've made it under oath, 3 hours of it starting at 11 last night." She heard nothing from his end for a moment. "The engineering memo from Veritas is in the evidentiary package. Your signature is on the contractor approval. The IG has a DOJ attorney joining the hearing this morning." She paused at a crosswalk. "So I want to understand what you think this phone call is going to accomplish." When he spoke again, something had shifted. Not the tone. He was still measured, still controlled, but there was a quality underneath it now, something tighter. "The identity protection motion," he said. "If I withdraw it, this becomes a much longer, quieter process. A review, not a public investigation. Records corrected through internal channels. No hearings. No press. You're offering to withdraw a motion you filed this morning as though that's a concession." "I'm offering to make this smaller," he said, "for both of us." Smaller means slower. Slower means you have time to reclassify the pre-deployment files. She crossed the street. "And I'm not interested in a quiet process, Colonel. I'm interested in an accurate record." "Sergeant Voss." "Bennett," she said, "and we're done." She hung up. Her hands were steady. She noticed that with some detachment, the part of her that had spent years observing her own physiological responses in high-pressure situations noted that her heart rate had elevated, but her distal control was fine. Good, even." She called Donahue. He picked up on the first ring. "I know," he said. "Tolliver just called. The leak. Marsh called me directly. 30 seconds ago. He knows everything. The building, the timeline, the DOJ attorney." She was already moving again. He offered to withdraw the identity motion in exchange for a quiet internal review. A pause. "He's scared. He's positioning. He knows the evidentiary package is strong enough to be a problem. He wants to reduce the venue." She turned onto the federal building's block. "More importantly, he has someone inside. That call told me things he shouldn't know. Things only someone in that room last night would have." "We have 4 people with full access to last night's session," Donahue said. "Me, Reeves, Hendricks, and 1 analyst who was processing the statement transcript. You need to figure out which one it is before the hearing. We're working on it." His voice was tight. "Get here. The DOJ attorney is already in the building, and she wants to speak with you before 9. The DOJ attorney's name was Carla Oduya, and she was 51, sharp-featured, with reading glasses she kept taking off and putting back on, and the specific bearing of someone who had spent decades in rooms where people tried to waste her time and had developed efficient countermeasures. She shook Mara's hand without preamble and got directly to it. "I've read your statement. I've reviewed the evidentiary package." She set her glasses on the table. "I want to talk about the phone call." Mara had already told Donahue. She told it again, compressed, accurate. Oduya listened without writing anything down, which meant she was listening in the way that actually captures things. When Mara finished, she looked at Donahue. "That call is itself evidence," she said. "He referenced the building, the timeline, information he should not have access to. If we can establish he received it from an inside source, it supports a broader obstruction framing," Donahue said, "which is what we want." She put her glasses back on. "Here's where we are. The reclassification motion is being heard at 10. Our counter motion is filed. The identity protection motion they added this morning is legally thin. It's a delay tactic, and the judge will likely see it as such, but likely isn't certain." She looked at Mara. "I want to enter the phone call as supplemental evidence. I need your consent to use the call record." "You have it." "I also want Tolliver in that hearing room as a present witness, not just a submitted statement. If Marsh's team pushes back on the authenticity of the documentary evidence, I want a live body who was there." "He'll be there," Tolliver said from the corner of the room where he'd been standing since Mara arrived. Oduya looked at him with the assessing gaze of someone filing him away accurately. "And I want you, Chie," she said, turning back to Mara, prepared for the possibility that Marsh's team will try to introduce your altered medical record during the hearing as evidence that Ferran's account is inconsistent. They may do it before we can formally enter the correction. How do I prepare for that? By having someone who can speak to the record's alteration on the spot. She looked at Donahue. "We've pulled the access logs for the military medical record system," Donahue said. "There are 2 entries that post-date the operation and predate Mara's, Bennett's separation. Someone accessed and modified the file." He set a paper on the table. "The access credentials belong to an administrative account attached to the 114th command structure. The account was used 3 times in a 10-day window. The 3rd use closed the file with the altered version in place." "Can you trace the account to a specific person?" Oduya asked. "The account was nominally assigned to Colonel Marsh's administrative staff. We've identified the specific staff officer." He paused. "She retired 8 months ago, but as she's been interviewed, she's indicated she was directed to make the modifications and given the specific changes in writing." "In writing," Oduya repeated. "An email from Marsh's personal account." He paused. "She kept it." The room was quiet for a moment. Mara looked at Donahue. "How long have you had that?" "The email came in from her attorney at 4 this morning," he said, "after she saw the motions Marsh filed yesterday. Apparently it clarified for her which side of this she wanted to be on. There was something almost satisfying about that. The way Marsh's own aggressive legal maneuvering had tipped the calculation for someone who had been sitting quietly with a piece of evidence for 2 years. Almost satisfying, and also a reminder of how close all of it had come to not existing. "Is she willing to testify?" Oduya asked. "She will submit a declaration. She's not willing to appear in person. She has a medical condition that complicates travel. But a declaration with the email attached carries significant weight." Oduya took her glasses off again, looked at the ceiling briefly in the way of someone doing rapid structural assessment. "All right," she said. "This is what we have. Ferran's incident report, the Veritas engineering memo, 4 sworn soldier statements, Tolliver's testimony, Bennett's testimony, the access logs, the modification email and declaration from Marsh's former staff officer, and a direct contact attempt from Marsh to a protected witness." She put the glasses back on. "And we have 70 minutes up." The hearing was in a federal courtroom on the building's 4th floor, which was smaller than the word courtroom usually implies. A functional space, institutional lighting, the particular smell of a room where consequential things happen routinely and without ceremony. Marsh's legal team was 3 people. A lead attorney named Vickers, who was silver-haired and wore the specific confidence of someone accustomed to winning on procedural grounds, and 2 associates who sat very still and took notes. Marsh himself was not present, which told Mara something. Either he'd been advised not to appear, or he'd concluded, after the phone call, that the situation had moved past the point where his presence would help. She sat with Oduya at the respondent's table. Tolliver was in the gallery, which was small and held 4 other people, including a man in a suit she didn't recognize and General Harwick, who had apparently flown from wherever he'd been when Atlas broke his lead in a Denver airport terminal and decided this was worth his time. He caught her eye when she came in. He didn't nod or smile. He just looked at her with the expression of a man who has waited a long time to be in a specific room and is aware that the waiting is almost over. The judge was a woman named Cortland, 50s, with reading glasses that sat lower on her nose than Oduya's, and the brisk manner of someone who had read all the filings before she walked in and was not going to waste the morning establishing things that were already established. "We're here on 2 motions," she said. "The reclassification motion filed by Petitioner's Counsel and the counter motion filed by the government. We also have a supplemental motion filed this morning regarding witness identity verification. I've read all 3. She looked at Vickers. "Counsel, your reclassification argument rests primarily on national security grounds. Specifically, that the pre-deployment planning documents contain information whose disclosure would cause damage to ongoing intelligence operations." "That's correct, Your Honor." "Can you specify what ongoing operations would be affected?" Vickers opened a folder. "The Veritas Group continues to hold active defense contracts. The Veritas Group's current contracts are not the same as the operation in question," Judge Cortland said. "And the documents we're discussing are 27 months old. I'll need a more specific connection than contractor continuity." It was not a ruling, but it was a signal, and Vickers read it the way experienced attorneys read signals. He shifted his argument. For 40 minutes, the hearing moved through the kind of procedural density that looks impenetrable from outside and is, in practice, a series of very specific dominoes, Vickers argued. Oduya countered. Documents were submitted and referenced and read into the record. The Veritas engineering memo went in without the objection Mara had half expected, because Vickers apparently concluded that objecting to it would draw more attention to its contents than accepting it quietly. Then Oduya submitted the access log. Then the modification email. Vickers objected to both on authentication grounds, which bought him approximately 6 minutes before Judge Cortland looked at the declaration from Marsh's former staff officer and said, in the tone of someone closing a parenthesis, "The declarant is the account holder. Authentication is established. Objection overruled." The modification email went in. Mara watched Vickers, watched the slight adjustment in how he was holding his shoulders, the way his left hand stopped moving on his notepad. He knew what the email meant. He knew that his client had sent a written instruction to falsify a federal military record, and that instruction was now part of a federal court proceeding. What he didn't know was whether to have the conversation he needed to have with his client during the recess Judge Cortland called at the 45-minute mark, or whether doing so would itself create additional exposure. In the hallway, Donahue appeared at Mara's elbow. "Reeves," he said very quietly. She looked at him. "The leak. It was Reeves. He's been in contact with someone connected to Marsh's legal team. We think it started before this investigation, when he was working a separate contractor oversight case. He may not have known, initially, that the cases were connected." He paused. "He's been removed from the investigation. He's being interviewed now in a room on the 2nd floor. She stood with that. "Was he in the hearing room last night?" "Yes." "Then Marsh knew everything we submitted before 7 this morning." "Yes, but it didn't help him." He looked at the closed courtroom door. "The email changes everything. Vickers knows it. He's going to try to find a way to reframe this as a rogue staff action. That Marsh didn't know the modification was happening. That the staff officer acted unilaterally. The email is from Marsh's personal account." "I know. His team will argue it was spoofed or that the account was compromised. It won't hold, but it'll be the move." He looked at her. "Cortland is going to deny the reclassification motion. I'm almost certain. The identity protection motion is already dead. She hasn't mentioned it since the first 5 minutes, which means she dismissed it in her head before we started." "And then what?" "Then the investigation becomes formal and public. Marsh's legal exposure moves from a classification dispute to a potential criminal referral." He paused. "And your record gets corrected." She looked at the hallway, at the institutional lighting, at General Harwick, who was standing 30 feet away with a cup of coffee he wasn't drinking, looking at nothing. She walked to him. He turned when she was 10 feet out, which was either good situational awareness or he'd been watching her in his peripheral vision the whole time. "General," she said. "Sergeant," he said. Then, "Bennett, I don't know what to call you. Voss is fine, she said. For now. He nodded once. I owe you an explanation, he said. You owe me more than that. He took that without flinching, which she gave him credit for. When I saw you at the airport, I knew the 114th had been decommissioned. I knew there had been a separation process. I didn't know the specifics. I didn't know your record had been altered. He paused. I want to be clear about that. I should have known. That's a failure of oversight that I own. But I did not authorize what Marsh did. You knew him. I knew him. I worked with him. I didn't know he'd done this. His jaw tightened. When I got back to my office after the airport, I pulled everything I could access on the 114th's decommission. That's what prompted the IG contact. He looked at her. I should have pulled it 27 months ago. I'm aware of that. Yes, she said. You should have. There was a pause that had weight in it, the kind that happens between people who are both telling the truth and both aware that the truth has edges. The soldiers you pulled out, he said. All 4 are still serving. One of them made first sergeant last year. He paused. They submitted statements to the IG the same week they were asked, immediately. There was no hesitation. She didn't say anything. They've been trying to find you for a long time, he said. They didn't know you were alive either. She looked at the courtroom door. Let's get through the morning first, she said. Long. Judge Cortland denied the reclassification motion at 11:14 a.m. She read her ruling in the specific, unhurried cadence of someone who had written it carefully and wanted it heard the same way. The national security argument was insufficiently specific. The pre-deployment documents in question predated any currently active intelligence operation by a margin that eliminated reasonable classification justification. The Veritas Group's current contracts did not create a retroactive classification basis for documents related to a discontinued program. Motion denied. On the identity protection motion, she was briefer. The motion lacked legal precedent, and its practical effect would be to bar testimony from individuals with direct operational knowledge while protecting a third party from accountability for actions affecting those same individuals. Motion denied. Vickers requested an immediate stay pending appeal. Cortland denied the stay request with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had expected it. Mara sat and listened and felt something that was not quite relief and not quite satisfaction, something more complicated than both. Because the ruling meant everything and also meant that what came next was going to be harder in some ways than what had just happened. After the courtroom cleared, Oduya appeared at her shoulder. Marcia's legal team will file the appeal today, she said. It will be denied. The record on the motions is clean, and there's no appealable error. She paused. The criminal referral is a separate process. That goes to the U.S. Attorney's Office. Given the email, given the access logs, given what the staff officer has declared, I think the referral will result in charges. I can't promise a timeline. What are the charges likely to be? Obstruction. Falsification of federal records. Potentially, given the Veritas contractor situation and the operation compromise, something under the relevant national security statutes. That last piece is complex and will take longer to build. She looked at Mara directly. Your record correction is separate from all of that and moves faster. The IG can initiate a formal correction order today. Your military record, your actual record, can be restored within weeks. And the commendation? Oduya was quiet for a moment. That goes through a different process, a formal review board. It takes longer. She paused. But the evidentiary basis is solid. I don't see a realistic obstacle. Mara looked at the empty courtroom. Ferrand, she said. What happens to her promotion review? The IG can flag it for reinstatement review. That's outside my lane directly, but I can make sure the referral includes a specific note. She paused. You're asking about a lot of other people. They were all there, Mara said. It's not just my record. Oduya looked at her for a moment and then wrote something in her notepad. Outside the federal building, the March air was sharper than it had been that morning. A thin layer of cloud had come in from the west, and the mountains were half hidden, the kind of day that can't decide whether it wants to be winter or something else. Tolliver was on the steps, phone to his ear. He ended the call when she came out. Ferrand, he said. I called her after the ruling. She cried. He said it plainly, not as sentimentality, but as information. She's been sitting on that document for 27 months. She made copies of the copies. She kept them in 3 separate locations. I know what that's like, Mara said. Yeah. He put his phone in his pocket. She wants to talk to you. I'll call her tonight. He nodded. They stood there for a moment on the federal building steps in the cold, which was not comfortable but was real, and sometimes real uncomfortable is better than comfortable and artificial. The leak, she said. Donahue told me. Reeves. I know. He called me too. Tolliver's jaw was doing the thing it did when he was controlling something. Reeves might have thought he was working a separate thread and didn't realize the crossover. Or he knew exactly what he was doing. I don't know yet which is worse. Either way, Marsh knew everything before the hearing. And it still didn't help him. He looked at her sideways. That says something about the evidence. It says something about the email, she said. Nobody survives written instructions to falsify a federal record. He almost smiled again. Still not quite. They heard Atlas before they saw him. The click of nails on the building's side entrance stairs as the young handler came through with him in his vest, apparently having received instruction to bring him out. He saw Mara from 20 feet and his whole body went into the particular controlled urgency of a working dog who has been exercising patience and has now been told patience is no longer required. She crouched on the bottom step. He came to her at a controlled trot, not the airport sprint, and pressed his head into her hands and stood there with the absolute stillness of a dog who has finally stopped waiting. The young handler stood a few feet back with the lead slack in his hand, and the expression of someone watching something that he doesn't fully understand but recognizes as significant. What happens to him? She said to Donahue, who had come through the door behind the handler. After today. Donahue looked at the handler. The handler looked at Donahue. That's a conversation for the next few days, Donahue said carefully. There are protocols for K-9 reassignment that involve... I know what the protocols are, she said. I'm asking what happens to him. Donahue paused. Harwick has already indicated he wants to see a resolution that makes sense. He was fairly specific about what he meant by that. Another pause. I don't think Atlas is going anywhere you're not. She scratched behind his ears. He closed his eyes with the expression of a dog who has made an extensive and comprehensive peace with his circumstances. She was back at Riverside Memorial by 2 in the afternoon. She had not called ahead, had not arranged anything, had simply come through the main entrance with her badge clipped to her jacket, and taken the elevator to the 3rd floor and appeared at the nurse's station, where Darcy was doing med reconciliation, and looked up and said, "Oh, thank God," before apparently remembering that she'd been trying to seem calm about the past several days. I'm fine, Mara said. You left the building at night and didn't come back, Darcy said. Keith told administration the federal agents had been here again, and then nobody could reach you, and your shift this morning was covered by a float nurse who... I know. I'll talk to administration. She paused. I'm sorry you were in the middle of it. Darcy looked at her for a long moment with the specific, calibrated perception of a nurse who has been doing this for 30 years and has learned to read people through the versions of themselves they present. Are you actually fine? She said. Not entirely, Mara said. But I will be. Darcy nodded once, in the way of a person who accepts an answer not because it's complete, but because it's honest. Mrs. Fassbender in 308 has been asking about you, she said. She says she's concerned about the nurse who looked like something was eating at her. Mara went to 308. Mrs. Fassbender was sitting up in bed with the elevated alertness of a woman who has not allowed a hospital stay to reduce her wattage, and she looked at Mara when she came in with the same assessing gaze from 2 days ago. You look different, Mrs. Fassbender said. I look the same. No, you don't. Something happened. She studied her. Something good or something hard? Mara checked the IV site, the telemetry reading, the drainage from the ablation site. All appropriate. She documented while she answered. Both, she said. Mrs. Fassbender accepted this the way she seemed to accept most things. Completely, without requiring elaboration, but with her attention fully on it. My husband used to say that the hardest things and the best things are usually the same thing, she said. I spent 22 years thinking that was too neat, too simple. A pause. I think I was wrong. Mara did not say anything. She finished her assessment, documented the readings, and stood at the foot of the bed for a moment. You'll be going home tomorrow, she said, if the morning labs look the same. I know. Mrs. Fassbender looked at her. Will you be here? I'll be on shift, Mara said. The woman nodded, satisfied with that in a way that Mara didn't quite have words for. She went back to the nurse's station and picked up the rest of the afternoon's work, because the afternoon's work was there and needed doing, and because there was something grounding in the specific demands of a cardiac step-down unit that she had come, in 8 months, to genuinely need. At 4:30, Donahue texted, Marcia's attorney contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office at 2 p.m. We think he's negotiating a cooperation agreement. She read the text in the break room. Cooperation agreement meant Marsh was trying to reduce his exposure by giving the prosecutor something, information, context, other people involved. It meant he had concluded the email was unsurvivable in a trial. It meant his calculation had shifted from containment to damage limitation. She texted back, Does that affect the record correction timeline? Donahue, No. That moves forward regardless. I've already submitted the initiation request. She put the phone in her pocket. She finished the shift. Gave a thorough handoff to the night nurse. Drove home through Denver in the early dark, the mountains invisible now behind the cloud layer. The city doing what cities do. Indifferent and continuous and completely unaware that anything had shifted. She fed Ridgeline. Sat at her kitchen table. Called Ferran. Major Louise Ferran picked up on the third ring, and her voice had the quality of someone who had been holding something very heavy for a very long time and had just been told they could set it down. They talked for an hour. Mara didn't plan to talk for an hour, but Ferran had things she'd been waiting to say, and Mara found that she had things she'd been waiting to hear, and the conversation moved the way honest conversations move. Not tidily, not without difficulty, but towards something that felt like solid ground. When she hung up, it was after 9. She sat in the quiet apartment and let the quiet be quiet, which it had not been for the last several days in the same uncomplicated way. Her phone lit up. Tolliver. Marcia's lawyer just issued a statement to the press. It's already on 2 news sites. They're framing it as a voluntary cooperation with an ongoing investigation into contractor oversight failures. She read it twice. Then, he's going to try to control the narrative. Voluntary cooperation, contractor failures. He positions himself as a whistleblower, not a subject. I know, she wrote back. Send me the links. She read the coverage. Both articles were sparse. The story had broken in the last 30 minutes, and neither reporter had much more than the statement and the basic federal investigation framework. Neither article mentioned Mara. Neither mentioned the 114th or the altered records or what had actually happened in that building 27 months ago. In Marcia's version of this story, he was a conscientious retired officer helping investigators understand contractor failures in a discontinued program. He was, in this framing, helpful. He was, in this framing, barely involved. She set the phone down. She thought about the 4 soldiers giving statements immediately, without hesitation. She thought about Ferran keeping copies of copies in 3 separate locations for 27 months. She thought about Tolliver living out of a duffel bag in a Denver motel for 6 days because he'd followed an investigation across the country on the slim chance that it might become survivable. She thought about Atlas pressing his face into her palm in a hospital hallway with 8 months of waiting in every muscle. The narrative Marsh was trying to build was clean and self-serving and completely absent of every person whose life his decisions had actually touched. She picked up the phone and called Oduya. I saw the statement, Oduya said before Mara could speak. What can we do about it? Officially, nothing yet. Cooperating subject, ongoing investigation. There are constraints on what the government can release. A pause. Unofficially, what I can tell you is that Donahue has already been in contact with the reporter at the Post who covers federal investigations. He hasn't said anything that violates protocol, but he's made sure she has the right questions. What questions? The ones that lead to the soldiers. The ones that lead to Ferran. A beat. And the ones that lead to you, if you decide you want to be part of that story. Mara was quiet for a moment. I'll think about it, she said. That's all I'm suggesting, Oduya said. Think about it. You don't have to be invisible anymore. That was always his choice, not yours. She hung up, sat in the kitchen for a while longer. At 10:40, a new text came in from a number she didn't recognize. Different from Marsh's, different from Tolliver's, different from any number she had in her phone. She opened it. My name is First Sergeant Dale Okonkwo. You don't know me, but I was in that building. I've been trying to find the right words to send this for 14 months. I just want to say thank you. I have a daughter now. Her name is Rosie. She's 8 months old. She read it 3 times. Then a second text from the same number. The other guys feel the same. We've all been interviewed. We're ready to say publicly whatever needs to be said. Just tell us where and when. She set the phone face down on the table, pressed her palm flat against the wood. Outside, Denver was quiet in the particular way of a weeknight in March. Traffic thinning, the ambient hum of a city settling. Somewhere in a federal building, Reeves was being interviewed about his contact with Marsh's people. Somewhere, a U.S. attorney was reading a cooperation request and deciding what it was worth. Somewhere, Vickers was sitting in an office doing the math that attorneys do when they realize the story their client has been telling them is significantly shorter than the one on record. And somewhere on the other side of this city, in whatever arrangement the handlers had worked out, Atlas was in a kennel or a vehicle or a room, and he had not, in 8 months, through 2 handler requests for reassignment, through whatever version of waiting a dog does, stopped. Her phone lit up again. This time it was Donahue. Not a text, a call. She answered. "We have a problem," he said. "Marsh's cooperation agreement. The terms his lawyer proposed to the U.S. attorney include a provision that any materials generated from the IG investigation be treated as confidential during the cooperation period." She felt it before she understood it. "He's trying to seal the investigation again," she said. "Not permanently, but during the cooperation window, which his team has proposed as 90 days. Nothing goes to press. Nothing goes to any external review board. No record corrections are finalized." He paused. "If the U.S. attorney accepts those terms, your record correction gets delayed 90 days. Farhan's promotion review gets delayed. The soldier statements go into a sealed file. And in 90 days, he argues the cooperation period should be extended. That's the concern, yes. Does the U.S. attorney know about the outlet contact, the reporter at the Post? Not from us. But if the story breaks before the agreement is signed, then the cooperation terms become moot," she said, "because there's no confidential investigation to protect." A pause. "I can't tell you to call anyone," he said carefully. "I'm a federal investigator, and this is an active case." "I know. I also can't stop you from doing anything outside my jurisdiction." Another pause. "The reporter's name is Vivian Sato. She covers federal courts for the Post, and she's been on the contractor oversight beat for 2 years. He hung up. Mara sat with the phone in her hand for 40 seconds. Then she picked it up and typed Vivian Sato's name into a search engine, found the reporter's contact page on the Post website, and stared at the email address. She had spent 8 months being invisible. She had signed papers and changed her name and moved to a city she'd chosen partly because she didn't know anyone there. And she had built a life out of the parts of herself that didn't require explanation, and she had been very, very good at it. But the thing about invisible, she was only now fully understanding, was that it doesn't protect you. It just protects the people who made you that way. She opened her email. She started typing. She had 3 sentences written when her laptop screen filled suddenly with an incoming video call. Not from any address she recognized, not from Tolliver or Donahue or anyone she'd spoken to in the last 3 days. The caller ID read, Veritas Group, legal. Her hand stilled on the keyboard. The call rang once, twice. Whatever Marsh had offered the U.S. attorney in his cooperation agreement, whatever 90-day window his lawyers were trying to construct, someone at Veritas Group had just decided that Marsh was no longer a solution to their problem. He was a liability. And they were calling the person whose testimony could determine the difference. She let it ring 4 times. Not because she was afraid to answer, because she needed 4 seconds to decide who she was going to be in this conversation. The person who had spent 8 months being carefully invisible, or the person who had spent 27 months being owed something. She answered. The voice on the other end was a woman. Mid-40s, Mara estimated, from the quality of it. The particular tone of someone who has spent years delivering difficult things in controlled registers. Ms. Bennett, my name is Patricia Halloran. I'm General Counsel for the Veritas Group. A pause. I want to be direct with you. We are aware of the IG investigation. We are aware of the documents and evidence. And we are aware that Colonel Marsh filed a cooperation agreement proposal with the U.S. Attorney's Office this afternoon. I'm aware of those things too, Mara said. Then you should also be aware that Marsh's proposed cooperation terms are not something Veritas agreed to, was consulted on, or endorses. The woman's voice was careful and also, underneath the careful, genuinely tense. He does not have authority to speak on behalf of this company in any legal proceeding. His employment with Veritas concluded 14 weeks ago. Mara sat back. When did he leave? She said. 14 weeks ago, voluntarily. We became aware, at that point, of certain aspects of his prior military role that were inconsistent with what he had represented to us at the time of his hire. You found out about the operation. A pause. We found out about the engineering memo. Our current legal team is not the team that was in place during the relevant contract period. When the new team reviewed the historical files 6 months ago, they flagged the internal communication about the communication frequency vulnerability. Another pause, longer. We have been cooperating with the IG investigation since November, quietly and at our own initiative. Mara was quiet for a moment. Why are you calling me directly? She said. Because Marsh's cooperation proposal includes a provision that would seal the investigation for 90 days. And we want you to know that Veritas is not supporting that provision, does not want that provision, and will formally oppose it if the U.S. Attorney gives us the opportunity. Halloran's voice had something in it now that wasn't quite discomfort but was adjacent to it, the sound of an institution trying to put distance between itself and a decision it made by accident and a man it hired without knowing what he'd done. We have submitted our own supplemental materials to the IG. They include the full internal engineering review from the relevant contract period, the communications chain between the project manager and the contracting officer, and the flagged memo in its original unredacted form. The unredacted form, Mara said. What does the redacted version leave out? A pause. The project manager's notation that the vulnerability had been verbally communicated to the military contracting officer prior to the written memo. She paused. The contracting officer at that time was Colonel Marsh. Mara looked at her kitchen ceiling. He had known before the memo was written. The memo had been the written record of something he'd already been told verbally and had chosen to proceed past. The redacted version removed the notation and made it look like a systemic failure, an institutional gap, something nobody caught in time. The unredacted version made it a decision. How long has your legal team had the unredacted version? She said. Since November, Halloran said quietly. It was submitted to the IG in December. It is already part of the evidentiary record. A pause. I'm telling you this because I think you deserve to know what the record actually contains, and because I believe the cooperation agreement proposal Marsh made today is an attempt to prevent that record from becoming public in a way that is not in your interest, or in Veritas's interest, or in the interest of what actually happened. Mara said nothing for a moment. Then, you said your employment of Marsh ended 14 weeks ago. Yes. Voluntarily. I was given a choice, Halloran said, with the specific dryness of a lawyer who has learned to be precise about words. He chose voluntary separation. All right, Mara said. Thank you for calling. Ms. Bennett, Halloran started. I know what I need to know, Mara said, and I have an email to finish writing. She hung up. She went back to the half-written email on her screen. Vivian Sato, the post, the contact page she'd had open for the last 12 minutes. She deleted what she'd written and started over. She wrote for 25 minutes. Not a long email. 4 paragraphs. Specific, factual, with no language she couldn't support, and no claims she wasn't prepared to stand behind. She identified herself. She referenced the IG investigation. She noted the cooperation agreement proposal and the 90-day confidentiality provision. She described what the unredacted Veritas engineering memo contained and what it meant about Marsh's prior knowledge. She read it twice, changed 2 words, read it again. She copied Oduya and Donahue on it, which was not legally required, and which gave them no instruction, and which simply meant they would know, when the call came, what she had done and why. Then she sent it. She slept better than she'd expected to. Not well, not deeply, but in the uncomplicated way of someone who has made a decision and no longer needs to debate it in the dark. She woke at 6:15, fed Ridgeline, drank coffee standing at the kitchen window in the early gray light. Vivian Sato had responded at 2 a.m. Thank you for reaching out. I've been working this investigation for several weeks. I'd like to speak with you at your earliest convenience. What I have from other sources, combined with what you've shared, substantially changes what I can publish. I want to make sure the story I write is accurate. Are you willing to go on record? Mara texted back at 6:22. Yeah, call me after 8. Sato called at 8:01. She was direct in the way good reporters are direct, not aggressive, but economical, asking what she needed to know and not what she thought would make a better story. She had clearly done substantial reporting before the email arrived. She knew about the 114th decommission. She knew about the IG investigation in general terms. She had spoken to at least one of the 4 soldiers, Mara could tell from the questions, and she had clearly read the federal court filings from yesterday's hearing. What she hadn't known, before the email, was the unredacted memo, the verbal communication, the notation. She asked Mara about it twice, from 2 different angles, making sure she had it right. He knew before the memo, Mara said. The notation confirms he was told verbally. He proceeded anyway. And the operation launched how long after that verbal communication? I don't know the exact date of the verbal conversation. The memo was dated 11 days before deployment. The notation indicates the verbal communication preceded the memo. She paused. I'd ask Veritas's legal team. They have the documentation. Sato wrote something. I've already spoken with Patricia Halloran's office. They confirmed the supplemental submission to the IG. A pause. Ms. Bennett, I want to ask you something directly, and you can decline to answer. Go ahead. You were in Denver for 8 months before any of this surfaced. You had a functional life, a nursing career. A lot of people in your position would have stayed quiet. Why didn't you? Mara thought about the question. I didn't choose for this to surface, she said. A dog recognized me in an airport. That was the beginning. She paused. But I think, if it hadn't been that, it would have been something else eventually. You can close a door, but that doesn't mean the room behind it stops existing. She paused again. And there are 4 soldiers and a warrant officer and a major who've been carrying this for the same amount of time I have. It's not just my name. It was never just my name. Sato was quiet for a moment. Can I quote that? Yes, Mara said. What? The story ran online at 11:47 on a Thursday morning. Mara was on shift. She found out when Darcy appeared in the hallway outside room 312 with her phone extended and a look on her face that combined pride and something that might have been awe and a quality Mara could only describe as the specific satisfaction of a 51-year-old woman who has been patient with a secret she didn't know she was keeping. You were in the military, Darcy said. Yes. Special operations. Classified support unit. Darcy looked at the phone, then at Mara. It says you carried people out of a burning building. I did. And then you came here and worked cardiac step down and never said a word. That was the situation, Mara said. Darcy put the phone down, looked at her for a long moment with the particular expression of someone who is recalibrating an understanding they thought was complete. Okay, she said finally, in a tone that covered a great deal of ground. I have labs to check in 308, Mara said. Go check them, Darcy said. The story had 37,000 reads by noon. By 2 in the afternoon, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets and a wire service. Sato had written it carefully and factually. She'd named Marsh, she'd described the operation in the terms available to her through the declassified IG materials. She'd described the record alteration and the cooperation agreement proposal and the Veritas unredacted memo. She had quoted Mara twice. Both quotes Mara had given her knowingly and without revision. She had described Atlas. That, it turned out, was the part people responded to. Not the corruption, not the legal maneuvering, not the federal court hearing. The detail that traveled fastest across the networks of people who share things. The story of a dog who spent 8 months being difficult, refusing commands, requesting 2 handler reassignments, waiting in whatever way a dog waits, for the person whose commands matched the ones he'd been built to follow. At 3:15, while Mara was doing a medication reconciliation, her phone buzzed 4 times in a row. She looked after the 4th. The first 3 were from numbers she didn't recognize. The 4th was from Tolliver. Have you seen Twitter? She had not seen Twitter. She had been doing medication reconciliation. She looked at the first unknown number. A text. This is Corporal Remy Bastian. I was in the building. I gave my statement to the IG last month. I just want to say, we're all glad you're okay. We didn't know for a long time. Second unknown number. First Sergeant Okonkwo again. Rosie is wearing the little army onesie today. Felt like the right day for it. Third unknown number. My name is Major Anita Rourke. I served with the 114th. I wasn't there that night, but I knew you. I've been watching this investigation for 6 months, and I just want you to know there were more of us who knew your work than you probably realized. The right people always knew. She put the phone back in her pocket. She finished the medication reconciliation. She was a nurse. There was still a shift to complete. The cooperation agreement proposal Marsh had submitted to the U.S. attorney was formally rejected 4 days later. Oduya called to tell her. The rejection came with a counterproposal from the U.S. attorney's office. Marsh could cooperate without the 90-day confidentiality provision in exchange for a sentencing recommendation that would be determined by the quality and completeness of his cooperation. He had 72 hours to accept or proceed to indictment. What are the charges? Mara asked. Falsification of federal military records, obstruction of a federal investigation, and 1 count under the relevant national security statute related to the contractor Operation Compromise. Oduya paused. The third charge is the serious one. It carries significant sentencing weight. Will he accept? His attorney called within 3 hours of receiving the proposal. I think that answers the question. It did. Marsh accepted the cooperation agreement without the confidentiality provision. His cooperation, over the following 6 weeks, confirmed every material element of what Tolliver had reconstructed from the outside. The verbal communication from Veritas's project manager, his decision to proceed past the flagged vulnerability, his subsequent authorization of the record alteration, the email to his staff officer with specific instructions, the flagging of Mara's nursing license through a database channel he retained post-retirement. All of it came out in the cooperation sessions, documented, and added to a record that was already substantial. The staff officer who had made the alterations, her name was Sergeant Major Sandra Pruitt, retired, submitted a full declaration. She confirmed that she had received written instructions and had followed them, that she had not been told what the records contained or why they were being changed, and that she had kept the email because, in her words, she had not been able to make herself delete it. She was not charged. Her cooperation was complete, and her role, while not innocent, was that of someone who had followed an order from a commanding officer without understanding what the order was protecting. The Veritas Group reached a civil settlement with the Department of Defense. The terms were not public, but a DoD spokesperson confirmed that the settlement included remediation commitments and the cancellation of 1 active contract. Patricia Halloran's name did not appear in any of the coverage, which Mara suspected was part of the settlement structure. None of this happened quickly. None of it happened cleanly. There were weeks where the process seemed to move sideways instead of forward, where a filing or a countermotion or a scheduling delay made the timeline feel theoretical rather than real. Mara went to work on those weeks the same way she went to work on every other week. 12-hour shifts, cardiac step-down, the particular demanding rhythm of a unit where things can change in 30 seconds, and you are expected to be ready. She kept her name. Bennett. The record correction restored the parallel record. Voss, Mara A., Sergeant First Class, the full service history, the correct separation classification. But Bennett was the name she'd built 3 years of a life under, and she was not required to choose, and she did not. Her military record was formally corrected on a Tuesday in late April. The notification came as a letter, official seal, specific and bureaucratic in its language. She read it at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that was getting cold, and the letter said, in the specific prose of military administrative documentation, that her record had been amended to reflect accurate service history, that her separation had been reclassified from voluntary to medical administrative, that outstanding commendation proceedings had been initiated, and that her record of service in the 114th was now restored to its correct form. It was 2 pages. She read it twice, set it on the table, drank the cold coffee. Ridgeline walked across it because Ridgeline had no concept of the weight of documents and no interest in developing one. She picked the cat up and held him, which he tolerated for approximately 6 seconds before indicating that was sufficient, and he had places to be. The Commendation Review Board met in early May. It was not a dramatic proceeding. It was a panel of 3 officers in a room in a military administrative building, reviewing a body of evidence and applying established criteria. Mara attended with a JAG attorney, which felt strange and also necessary, and she gave a factual account of events when asked and answered specific questions about medical decisions and tactical choices and sequence of events. General Harwick was on the panel. He had recused himself from the earlier IG proceedings on grounds of conflict of interest. He'd known Marsh, had worked with him, needed to stay clean of anything that touched the criminal investigation. But the commendation review was a separate administrative process, and his presence on the panel was something he had apparently requested specifically. He asked her 2 questions. The first was about the medical intervention on Atlas, specifically the improvised pressure bandage, the field medication decision, the hold technique for transport. She answered in clinical terms. The second question was, at the point when you made the second trip back into the structure, what was your assessment of the structural integrity? She looked at him. Compromised, she said. I estimated 60% probability of partial collapse within the next 3 to 5 minutes based on the fire location, the floor material, and the sound the building was making. And you went back. Tolliver was in there, she said. Harwick wrote something and said nothing else. The review board issued its recommendation 3 weeks later. The commendation was approved. The specific decoration, its level, its formal designation, was included in a letter that arrived alongside the correction notification. She was not going to describe the decoration, not because it didn't matter, but because the thing that mattered was what it represented. And what it represented was that the record now said the true thing, and that the true thing had survived everything that had been done to bury it. Tolliver got his record corrected in the same cycle. His commendation had been a different action on the same night, and the review board processed them together. He texted her when his letter arrived. Mine came, he wrote. How does this work? I don't know how this works. She understood what he meant. The question wasn't about the process. It was about what you do with yourself after you've been carrying something for 27 months and someone finally takes it from you. What you put in that space. How you learn to walk without the weight you've organized your entire posture around. I don't know either, she wrote back. But I think that's okay. He sent back a single word. Yeah. Well, in the second week of May, Riverside Memorial Hospital held a staff recognition event. These happened periodically. The administration had a program, plaques on a wall, a reception with decent cheese and bad wine, and normally Mara attended for 20 minutes and left. This time, the hospital's chief nursing officer, a woman named Dr. Patricia Van, had called her into her office the week prior and told her, with the careful directness of a good administrator, that the hospital wanted to formally acknowledge what had come out about Mara's service history, and that they wanted to do it publicly, with her permission, at the May event. Mara had thought about it for 2 days. Then she said yes. Not because she wanted a plaque. She was not a plaque person, and she didn't anticipate becoming one. She said yes because Dr. Van had also told her that the hospital wanted to propose something else. A new role, part-time clinical, part-time trauma response coordination, working with the hospital's emergency and critical care teams on protocol development. The role had come out of a gap Dr. Van had noticed over the past several months. The gap between standard nursing protocols and the kind of rapid, resource-poor decision-making that mass casualty events and complex emergency situations actually required. A gap, Van had said, that she suspected Mara was more equipped to address than most people the hospital could hire. The role was real. Not a courtesy position, not a title without function. There was a job description, a salary, a reporting structure. There was a problem it was trying to solve. She said yes to both. The recognition event was on a Wednesday evening. The event room had decent cheese and bad wine as predicted, and about 60 people, most of them nursing staff, some administrators, 3 people from the hospital board, and Darcy, who was wearing the specific expression of someone determined not to cry, but prepared to revise that position if necessary. Tolliver came. He'd gotten an apartment in Denver. He hadn't gone back to wherever he'd been before, had seemed to conclude that wherever that was, it wasn't where he was going anymore. He stood near the back of the room and looked profoundly uncomfortable with the social dimensions of the event, but had come anyway, which was its own statement. General Harwick sent a letter. It was read aloud by Dr. Van, and it was 2 paragraphs, specific and formal, and it said, without sentimentality, that Mara's service had been exemplary, and that the record had not served the truth, and that the Army owed her better than what she had received. It was the kind of letter that military men of a certain generation write when they are trying to say something they're not entirely sure how to say, and the trying was visible in every sentence, and Mara found she respected it more for that. The four soldiers sent a video. She hadn't expected it. It was unpolished, clearly filmed on someone's phone in a kitchen somewhere. The four of them crowded into the frame with the awkward energy of people who are not performers and know it and are doing this anyway. Okonkwo was the one who spoke. He said they had wanted to find her for a long time. He said they had never stopped talking about what happened in that building. He said his daughter was 9 months old now and was very loud and very determined, and he thought she was going to be trouble, the best kind, and that he wanted Mara to know that he was going to tell Rosie when she was old enough to understand about the woman who had come back twice. Darcy cried. Mara held herself together by about the same margin she'd held herself together in the hospital corridor with Atlas's face in her hands, which was to say she held together, but it was work. Dr. Van said a few words. The plaque was presented. It was a good plaque. The hospital had opted for specific language rather than vague accolades, which Mara appreciated. It listed her nursing role and her military service in 2 separate clauses, connected by the word "and," which was the right word. She said a few words in return. She didn't write them down beforehand because she didn't trust prepared remarks to sound like herself, and she needed to sound like herself. She said, "I've been a nurse here for just over a year now, and the work is real. Whatever else has happened around it, that's been real. The patients are real, the decisions matter, and this unit is full of people who show up and do hard things without anybody making a ceremony of it. That's the job. I'm glad it was my job." She paused. "I'll keep doing it." That was all. People clapped. The bad wine kept circulating. Darcy squeezed her arm and said nothing, which was the right choice. Atlas came home in the 2nd week of June. This is the bureaucratic truth of it. The process of formally transferring a working military K9 to a handler involves veterinary records, temperament assessments, documentation of the animal's service history, a formal adoption agreement, and a period of transition monitoring. Mara understood all of these requirements and met all of them and did not hurry any of them, because Atlas was not an accessory to something that had happened. He was a working animal with 11 months of operational training, and 2 handlers had requested reassignment from him, and none of that disappeared just because the situation had changed. She worked with him 3 times a week during the transition period, sometimes on the grounds of the facility where he was kenneled, sometimes in a training space. She reestablished the command vocabulary, worked through the stress indicators, gave him time to adjust to civilian contexts in the way that working dogs sometimes struggle with. The ambient noise of public spaces, the unpredictability of people who aren't operating under protocol. He was not easy. He was never going to be easy. That was not what he'd been built for. But he worked with her in the particular focused way that indicated he had internally classified her as his operational partner, which in the taxonomy of a trained Malinois is a more durable category than anything humans call attachment. On the day she brought him home to the Globeville apartment, she sat on the floor of her living room for a moment and let him do what dogs do when they're in a new space. The systematic movement through rooms, the nose to every surface, the assessment. Ridgeline observed this from his perch on the kitchen counter with the absolute withering calm of an animal who has decided to handle this development through studied disdain. Atlas finished his circuit, came back to her, sat. She scratched behind his ears. He pressed into it. The apartment was quiet in the early evening, the particular June light coming in sideways through the window, and Mara sat on the floor and was present in that moment in a way she had not been present in a moment for quite a long time. Without the background calculation, without the peripheral awareness of exits and cameras and how long she'd been in one place. Just there. Just that room, that light, that dog pressing his head against her hands. She was not fixed. She was not the person she'd been before any of this, and she was not going to arrive at the end of the process at some uncomplicated version of fine. That was not how it worked. There were nights when she woke at 3 in the morning and lay in the dark with the sound of a building settling, and her body did not know the difference between that sound and other sounds from a long time ago. There were moments in the hospital when a particular smell or a particular quality of urgency moved through her and found old grooves that she had not fully filled in. She was going to carry some of this forever, the way people carry things, imperfectly and alongside everything else. But the record said the true thing now. That was not nothing. That was in fact everything it was, which was not everything but was enough. Enough to build from, enough to stop carrying alone, enough to let the next chapter start with accurate information about what the previous one had actually contained. In early August, Devian Marsh was sentenced in federal court. The sentencing was on a Wednesday. Mara did not attend. She was on shift. Oduya sent her a text at 11:42 a.m. 14 years. Falsification, obstruction, national security statute. Judge gave a statement from the bench about the deliberate nature of the actions and the specific harm to individual service members. It's on record. She read the text in the break room between patients. She sat with it for a moment. 14 years was a number. It was real and specific, and it meant that the federal legal system had assessed what Marsh had done and assigned it a weight, and the weight was 14 years of a man's life. That was not nothing either. It was also not undone time. It was not 27 months of living under a name that wasn't entirely hers, or 8 months of Atlas being difficult in a kennel, or Tolliver living out of a duffel bag, or Ferran's promotion sitting in a delayed review file, or Okonkwo not knowing for 14 months whether the woman who came back into the building was still alive. The law can account for the deliberate harm. It cannot account for the absence. The years that ran in the wrong direction, the version of a life that doesn't exist because someone made a decision and then made a second decision to cover it up. Those don't get a number. They just get acknowledged, and sometimes acknowledgement is what justice actually looks like when you strip the dramatic version away. She went back to her patients. On a Saturday in late August, Mara took Atlas to Washington Park. He was not a dog park dog, too much chaotic stimulus, too many uncertain variables, but the park's wide-open areas in the early morning, before the crowds arrived, suited him. She ran with him for 40 minutes through the park's long loops, and he ran with the ground-eating efficiency of a working dog who genuinely enjoys the work of moving, and she ran with the quality of a person who has been running since before it was light for most of her adult life, and who does not need music or distraction because the running itself is the thing. After, they sat by the lake in the early light. Denver in late August is one of the best versions of a city she had ever found. The heat breaking early in the morning, the mountains visible and clear on the western horizon, the particular quality of light before the day fully opens. She had chosen this city partly because she didn't know anyone there, and that was still true in its original sense, and was also no longer true in any meaningful way, which was one of the things about a city that you don't predict when you choose it. Tolliver had texted her that morning that he'd accepted a position, not military, but adjacent, working with a veteran transition program in the city. He'd asked if she wanted to get dinner that week. She'd said yes. Ferran's promotion review had been reinstated. The outcome was still pending, but reinstated meant the pause had ended, which was its own form of resolution. Okonkwo had sent a picture of Rosie in her army onesie, now too small, alongside a second picture of Rosie in a new onesie that said Future Sergeant in block letters. She had texted back 3 laughing emojis, which was not her usual register, but Rosie, in a Future Sergeant, onesie was objectively worth it. Atlas sat beside her and watched the lake with the focused, present attention of a dog who does not think about yesterday or tomorrow, who is completely and entirely in the moment of the water and the light and the smell of the morning, and who, this part she knew with the practical certainty of someone who had worked with him for 11 months and then met him again after 8, had no interest in being anywhere she was not. She looked at the mountains. She thought about what she would tell someone if someone asked her what the last 2 years had been. She'd tried to compose it a few times in her head, and each time it came out too long or too simple. The honest version was neither dramatic nor clean. It was, she had been erased, and she had survived the erasure, and the erasure had eventually made enough noise that the people responsible for it could no longer maintain it. That was the sequence. But inside the sequence was something else, the thing she had not expected, which was that surviving the erasure quietly, doing the job she had, being the nurse and the person and the professional that she'd been in 8 months of not being recognized for anything beyond that, had not been time lost. It had been time spent. The cardiac step-down unit was real. Darcy was real. Mrs. Fassbender, who had looked at her with the sharp eyes of a former judge and said, "Something's eating at you," on the second day of knowing her, was real. The patients who had lived because she'd caught something or moved fast or made the right call were real, and they were real regardless of what was or wasn't in her military file. She had been a good nurse before she was recognized as anything else. That was the part nobody could take back, Not because it was dramatic, but because it had happened day after day without an audience. That was the part she wanted to hold. She thought about what she would say to someone who had been erased, someone who had been told, by the weight of a system or a person or a set of circumstances that seemed unmovable, that their account of themselves was not the official version, that what they knew to be true was not what the record reflected, that the thing they'd done in the dark, without recognition, with no one watching, did not count because there was no one to confirm it. She would say, "The record being wrong doesn't make the action not have happened." She would say, "You carried 5 people out of a burning building whether or not the file says so. The 5 people know. The dog knows. You know. The truth doesn't require the document to exist. The document is just the truth getting its name back." She would say, "Surviving the silence is not the same as accepting it. There is a difference between keeping quiet and being kept quiet, and the difference matters. And there will come a moment when the silence becomes loud enough that even the people who designed it can't maintain it." She would say, "Be ready for that moment." Atlas shifted beside her, put his head in her lap, which he did sometimes, and only when the situation suited him, which meant she was not to read too much into it. She put her hand on his neck. The lake caught the early light. The mountains were clear on the horizon. The city behind her was beginning to wake up. She could hear the distant sound of it, the low and continuous hum of a place that does not stop, that rolls forward without waiting to be told it can. She had spent 27 months carrying a version of herself that the record didn't acknowledge. She had held it carefully, kept it intact, refused to let the absence of confirmation collapse it into doubt. That had cost her things, had cost her more than she could fully calculate, in the currency of years and possibilities and nights, when she lay awake in a German hospital or a studio apartment in Globeville, wondering whether she had done the right thing and whether it would ever matter that she had. It had cost her that, and she had come out on the other side of it with a corrected record, a commendation, a new role, a dog who had waited 8 months rather than reassign his loyalty, and 4 soldiers and a warrant officer who had kept the truth of what happened in their bodies for the same amount of time she had, and who had not let it get rewritten. She had not come out clean. She had not come out undamaged. She had come out with Atlas's head in her lap in a park in Denver in August, and with work she believed in, and with her name, both her names, the before and the after, attached to the accurate account of what she had done and who she was. That was what had survived. That was enough. She scratched behind his ears. He closed his eyes. The morning opened around them, indifferent and clear, and full of the ordinary, irreplaceable fact of being present in it. She was still here. That had always been the whole point.